Empires rarely collapse all at once, and money systems rarely fail in a way that feels dramatic at the beginning. Instead, they shift slowly, almost invisibly, until everyday people begin to notice that the rules they once relied on no longer behave the same way. And what history shows us is not a single catastrophic moment, but a pattern of gradual instability that quietly reshapes how individuals survive within those systems. If you were living in ancient Rome during the later years of the empire, nothing would have felt broken at first. Markets still existed, coins still circulated, wages were still paid. Yet over time, the silver content in Roman coins was reduced again and again, which meant that while people were technically receiving the same number of coins, the actual value embedded in those coins was shrinking. And this subtle shift created a disconnect between appearance and reality, where prices began to rise not because goods became more valuable, but because the money itself became less trustworthy. This pattern repeats across history, whether in Weimar Germany during the early 1920s or in more modern examples where inflation steadily erodes purchasing power. And what becomes clear is that most individuals do not react to these changes immediately, not because they lack intelligence, but because human psychology is anchored to stability, and we tend to assume that the systems around us will continue functioning as they always have, even when underlying mechanics are shifting in ways that are no longer sustainable. The psychological trap here is subtle but powerful, because when money loses value gradually, people often compensate by focusing on nominal increases rather than real outcomes. So a higher salary feels like progress, even if it barely offsets rising costs. And this creates a feedback loop where individuals believe they are moving forward while their actual financial position remains unchanged or even declines over time. From a mathematical perspective, the impact of this slow erosion is not linear but compounding, because each year of reduced purchasing power builds on the last, and even modest inflation rates, when sustained over long periods, can significantly reduce the real value of savings, which means that holding money without growth becomes increasingly risky, not in a dramatic sense, but in a quiet, persistent way that only becomes obvious after many years have passed. At a systemic level, these patterns are not accidents, but often the result of structural pressures within economies, where governments face incentives to manage debt, stimulate growth, or stabilize short-term conditions, sometimes at the expense of long-term currency stability. And while these decisions may be rational within their context, they create an environment where individuals must adapt, whether they fully understand the underlying mechanics or not. History suggests that those who navigate these periods more effectively are not necessarily the ones who predict collapse, but the ones who recognize gradual change early and adjust their behavior accordingly, which often means shifting focus from static saving to strategies that account for growth, resilience, and adaptability, rather than relying on assumptions of stability that may no longer hold. There is also an identity shift that tends to occur during these transitions, where people move from viewing money as a fixed store of value to understanding it as something dynamic, influenced by policy, time, and broader economic forces. And this shift is less about reacting to fear and more about developing a clearer mental model of how financial systems evolve under pressure. The lesson is not that collapse is inevitable or that stability is impossible, but that systems change in ways that are often gradual, complex, and psychologically difficult to detect in real time. And by the time those changes feel obvious, much of the adjustment has already taken place. So rather than focusing on dramatic scenarios, the more practical takeaway is to observe how small shifts accumulate, how incentives shape systems, and how personal financial behavior interacts with these larger forces. Because in the end, survival in changing economic conditions is less about predicting the future and more about understanding the patterns that have quietly repeated throughout history.